We are live. Greetings, everyone. I am Damien, aka Sleepy Reader. I have with me one of my longtime YouTube comic book friends, Gore Vidal, uh, famous for his hatred of Saga and his love for the cowboy cheerleaders.
Facts. Facts. Good
So
evening,
good to
everyone.
hear.
Good to see you all. Thanks for having me, Sleepy Reader, Damien.
My
Cheers.
pleasure. I'm very excited to have you on my channel.
Oh, I've
Um,
been looking forward to this for a long time.
and as we said before we went live, we have been chatting back and forth on YouTube for 10 years.
Yes, absolutely. 10 years.
And
A long time.
in comments, responding to each other's videos over the years. And, a, and a few times we've been on live hangouts together. And I used to think you were my age until I saw you, because for a long time you were just a pair of hands. And I realized, oh, you're actually younger than me. At least I think you are.
I'm younger, but I am old.
Yes.
I'm just aging well, or as we say here, it's the chemicals.
We've got a garage geek here, my good friend David.
Hey, it's good to
My
see
new
you.
David is like a new friend, new YouTube friend. You're an old YouTube friend. Gary B, the casual comic book guy, is here. Hello,
Gary.
Gary.
Hello, Gary.
And one of my favorite people. I don't think he's originally Australian, but he lives down under, I believe. Werewolf by Lunchtime. Barely Awake Reader, and also Gore.
He always shows up at the oddest times. I don't think he ever sleeps.
Yeah, I think often he's up at like 5 in the morning or something, or even earlier to watch the Cover Slingers. I don't know if you've watched that show, but it's one of my
I
favorites.
just see it whenever he shows up at all kinds of times, and it's quite amazing how he does this. He might be a werewolf
At least before lunchtime.
before lunchtime. But when do we want to know what his lunch is?
Right. I don't know.
I don't
He
know.
you aren't on social media, but he does
Mm.
post, I think, on Instagram pictures of his foot or something like that, or his cat, and then a TV screen. So he's got people on his big screen TV, YouTube people on his big screen TV. So
Gary's on, and it's funny about Gary. He had asked a while back. He had invited me to be on his show, and whenever I would post my email address to Gore Vidal, because it's on my channel,
oh, okay.
I think it would
I
be
didn't even realize
blocked.
that.
It would be blocked on his channel, I think, because he wouldn't see it.
Oh yeah, when you try to post things that are like links, sometimes they block them in the
And
and
so
I think I tried to give someone you used to be able to give someone your email through YouTube, but now it's hard.
hey, CK.
Hey, yep.
Yeah,
Terrence likes your look today.
I stole a Chromebook. Well, I borrowed a Chromebook, CK. So
Yeah, and this
along,
Chromebook has amazing sound too, which blows my mind.
I feel like one of the time bandits. We know how they steal the map, and keep thinking the creator is going to come searching for it.
So Gary never saw your email. You know what? Gary and I follow each other on Instagram. Do you mind if I give him your email?
Oh, not at all. Please
Yeah,
do.
I'll try to remember to do that after the
Please
show.
do. Please do. Gary's fascinating because up until I met him, I mean, you were the biggest Conan fan that I knew.
Yeah, he outstrips me by far.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, that's true. I mean, he knows everything about the history of Robert E. Howard and Conan, and actually anything Robert E. Howard related. It's quite impressive
Yeah.
how much he knows. And so I've always enjoyed whenever he does his programs, his reviews of the magazines. Even if I don't comment, I enjoy watching them. But
Right.
it's just fascinating to me.
Yeah, to me, he feels like both a fan and kind of a scholar of the history
Yeah.
of Conan and Robert E. Howard and the like.
We had those fan magazines. I mean, I know one of our fellow YouTubers has a fan magazine, but if there was a if he had been born maybe a generation earlier, he would probably contributed to those fan magazines that existed in the
Right.
70s. And he would have been, I think he would be quite, like I said, he's very knowledgeable.
Yeah. There used to be a Conan fan magazine called Amara or Amra. It's what the what Conan's name was when he was a pirate along the Black Coast, which meant lion in someone's language. Excuse me. The beer's getting to me.
Yeah. Alcohol is your friend. Anyone who says otherwise is not your friend.
So because, we talk about a lot of the similar books are not that we have exactly the same taste, but there's plenty of intersections.
Yes.
So before I realized that you were younger, I thought you, like me, had your teenage years in the 70s. When were your teenage years? The 80s?
The 80s, the early 80s.
Early 80s.
And the early 80s, and they were my teen years.
Okay.
And but the thing is, like I mentioned you before, what happened with us is that we came from I mean, I'm an American, but only
Right.
because of my mother's doctor was in the States when she gave birth to us, and because she was of age, and it was a risky birth. And then I grew up. I spent some years in Mexico, my early years,
Uh-huh.
and then we came over here. And in the 70s, the very early 70s, I was very young, very little, and so I have an accent because Spanish is my first language, and so I had to learn English. And so the 70s and the late 70s and early 80s were the teenage years. And I've mentioned this before, probably with you or with Terrence somewhere else. Is if you've ever seen the movie Lone Star by John Sayles,
Yes, I
that's
saw it a long time
basically,
ago.
yeah, it's one of the best films ever made about Texas. It gets us right, and it was basically a community pretty much like that, and very small, provincial, and the issues that you saw there were the issues we grew up with. And so limited access to a lot of things, comics, movies, etc.
Right.
And so yeah, so basically yes, and the Bad News Bears, for example, was basically a typical childhood for us. Just that
Uh-huh.
environment, it was just like that. I mean, those kids were just like us. That's just the way we were.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and so yeah.
Hello, Kyle. So, and also I've gathered from videos that the Catholic Church played a big role.
Yeah, that.
And although I guess it's a different Catholic Church, the sort of an Irish Catholic Church played a big role in my upbringing. And somehow I feel that can flavor one's imagination or something in a way.
Oh, it does, because I remember Anthony Burgess because Anthony Burgess was also raised Catholic, and he said something about, and I agreed with him about how just understanding the Trinity,
Mm-hmm.
and when you're a child, it's a very complex sort of understanding where
That's
you
a good
have
point. Yeah.
the Holy Spirit, God, the man. They're separate and yet they're one.
Right.
I mean, it's very complicated. And then when you have the saints and the role of Mary and the ritual,
And
I mean, every mass is ritual.
communion, which only for Catholics is literally Christ, along with it being a piece of bread.
Yes, basically, it's literally and also a metaphor.
Right. So
early on, before we know the words metaphor,
you have to think in two ways at the same time, in weird kind of ways.
And I think that's why it was. So I think to Burgess's point was, if you understand something that complex very young, then when it comes to literature, I mean, the world is quite wide open. Now, the restrictions really occur is if you are, because I remember there was Jesuits that we knew, anything about the Jesuits order. It's like the movie The Mission, right?
Mm-hmm.
You have the more liberal groups, which are the ones from The Mission, right? Jeremy Irons, and then Robert De Niro when he converts and becomes a priest. And then you have a very extreme conservative right-wing group of the church. And the more liberal wing is very open to just humanity in a sense. You tolerate things. There's
Right.
a strong sense of tolerance, and you're not turned off by anything, because the way they see it is, if it's made by God, it can't be bad, and it may be different and such, but it can't be terribly bad. But no, the other extreme of the Jesuit order, you're going to hell. You can't be doing this sort of nonsense, right? And so anyway, understanding all these dichotomies,
Right.
and for us, when I came, I went to a private school, and I would be dropped off at a church at around 6:30 in the morning, only because that was the only time my sister went to public school could drop me off. So I would be the only one at the school. And one
Wow.
day, and I would, and it would sometimes be extremely cold, so I would be near the church. The church would be closed, and that was like a little alcove that I could sit in. And one day, the nuns came by. One of the nuns, she was from Spain, because although this was like the film, like in Lone Star, you had a lot of foreigners there in this little place who came from
Mhm.
mostly from Spain or Mexico. And you could tell some of them were not happy about being in this small little Texas town, because this little small Texas town was not like the films you see in John Ford. These were not like the westerns you see,
Right.
right? So there was a huge disappointment on some of their faces. Anyway, one saw me, goes, "What are you doing here? When I'm waiting for school to start at 8?" She goes, "Well, there's a mass at 7, and you're an altar boy," because we all had to be altar boys by second grade. All of the boys had to be altar boys.
Second grade. Wow.
Second grade, we started early. So basically, I did mass Monday through Friday, and then on Sundays, of course, I had to go to church, and sometimes I would do the mass. So I like to joke now to my friends who are strong Catholics, and they ask me, "Do you go to church?" I go, "No, I did my time." And I don't go into as to why, but like I told you, I did my time.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, being forced to be an altar boy. I think they were volunteers at my church, but
Oh no, it was that's just the way it was. I didn't mind it though. I really liked it.
yeah.
Just depending on which priest we were going to get. I mean, some of them were again pretty bitter and pretty angry, and some of them, I know one of them, you could always smell the scotch on his breath.
Were
And
they bitter because they were
I think because they were there.
in Texas, or were they just bitter about the church in general?
They're probably bitter because they were in Dallas or one of the big cities.
Right.
I
And
mean,
were
because
you
you
in
hear
Catholic school the whole way through, or was it just
no, just
elementary school?
up until around the 7th grade, and so much of it just around there, and then it ended, and then I went to public school, and then it was public school from there onward. But I got a taste of both worlds, of the
Right.
private and the public, and I remember, I think it was when Reagan came into the presidency in the 80s, and you had this new group of the evangelicals coming in, and or just this idea that basically, we have prayer in the schools. And I remember thinking, we prayed every day. I went to mass every day. But I remember as soon as the prayer was over, the boys were undressing the girls and saying the nastiest things you can imagine, and cursing like you can name it, getting
This
into
was in the
fights.
public school or the
This
Catholic
is
school?
the private school, in
Private
Catholic
school. Okay.
school. And I remember in 5th grade or 6th grade, this poor young teacher, my classmates tormented her. They were cruel to her. They said, "You have a mustache." And it's interesting, we're all in school uniform. You have a picture of Christ right up above us. And the maliciousness from some of the boys towards this poor soul. And so I was wow. And I said, "Really? You think prayer is going to solve the problem?" Those of us who have gone through these things, that's not going to solve the problem. So,
Right.
of behavior and morals and all that sort of thing. And I remember one of the scandals with us, I remember with the 7th or the 8th grade, one of the girls got pregnant. And this was like a big deal. Obviously, back then it was a big deal. And, not just because of the poor girl's soul, but of course it was at that time was very shameful. And I don't know whatever happened to that poor girl. I think she'd have probably left town.
Wow. Um, do you remember the first time you sort of fell in love with a book, or the first time you felt like a reader, or the beginning, the earliest kind of excitement over a book? Any memories of that kind of thing?
That's tough because I didn't become a reader till I was older, a serious reader. But I do remember back to elementary school, you probably had this when you were in school, but they would bring a catalog and you could order books.
Right. I
Yeah.
think the Scholastic catalog or
I
something
think it
like
was
that.
kind of like that. And now my English was not very good. And I mean, I remember my first couple of grade levels, it was like Charlie Brown. What I mean by that is, and it was just the way it was for many of us.
Wah, 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 wah.
Yeah, because I didn't understand anything the teachers were saying in math or in anything. I just had to put things together. And my family didn't speak any English.
Right.
And so, um, I mean, that's the way it was for us back then. And I remember ordering a Jack London book. And I'm not sure if it was which one it was, but it was obviously one of the Wolf books. I know later on he wrote some science fiction books. He wrote other
Mhm.
things.
Call of the Wild,
It
perhaps?
might have been Call of the
I
Wild,
read that, I
probably.
remember, in maybe junior high or somewhere.
So it's one of the earliest books that I can remember. And then, but I didn't really fall in love with the book. And then when the Neil Adams, before I knew it was Neil Adams,
Mhm.
when the Neil Adams paperbacks of Tarzan, because I like Tarzan. Because back
Uh-huh.
then, those black and white films of Johnny.
Right.
Um,
Johnny Weissmuller and Maureen
oh, I
O'Sullivan.
liked those a lot. I wanted to be him, and even before I understood what sex was. I mean, I wanted to be with him and her. And that's why I found when Boy appeared, I found that extremely annoying. I mean, I said, why is he there? I mean, I wanted to be him, Tarzan.
Right.
And so when those began to appear, I found those covers utterly fascinating. The way he drew Tarzan.
Those were great covers, and people don't
You
talk enough about it, what a good painter Neil Adams
know,
was.
no, they were fantastic covers, and this thing's falling here. It's going to fall on my head.
Uh-oh.
And the and also physically, right? And because this was the 70s and the 80s, and the boys had certain physical expectations how to look like, right? He wasn't all big and bulky.
Right.
He wasn't all scrawny. He wasn't dumpy or chubby. He's got the perfect muscle tone, like a swimmer.
Swimmer's body, yeah. Yeah.
Swimmer's body. And I remember that's what, I aspired for that. Obviously, I didn't get it, but I did begin to swim later on. But so I began to read some of those books and I liked them. But again, they didn't really grab me. So then when I saw the Robert E.
Was that
Howard,
the language, or was it just the books themselves that didn't grab you?
just didn't grab me. I liked them. And it might have been the
Uh-huh.
language as well. And but these didn't grab me. And and then when I saw the Robert E. Howard books, and who did those covers for those Conan books? Was it Frazetta?
The most well-knowns are the Frazetta covers, yeah.
Okay. So then I began to pick up those, and I like those too, but I wasn't consistent with them. And so comics began to play a role. Comics began to play a role early on because when we came here, I brought some of my comics when I was little, and one of them was Kaliman. Kaliman's not known here. Of course, Fantomas is not known either, but Kaliman is less known here. But Kaliman was a superhero. I think all these people were influenced by Lee Falk's The Phantom. Because
Uh-huh.
Lee Falk's The Phantom, one of the things about him, one, he's exotic, but also he tries not to kill his opponents. He's very careful. He rarely ever kills anybody. He goes out of his way not to do that. And whenever he has to use his gun, he tries to shoot at the arm or the hand. That's something
Does he wear a costume?
Kaliman does, but Kaliman has this Hindu dress.
Hmm.
That's his dit. He's European or Caucasian, but he's got the Hindu garb and the Hindu clothing.
Weird. Okay.
And they're one of the most popular comics in Mexico. I forget what decade it started, and they would be published. Like I've shown some of my Fantomas in small sizes, square sizes,
Mm-hmm.
and they were wonderful, cheap paper and everything. And with them came with some of the Fantomas comics. Of course, when I came to the States, I couldn't find those. But I
Right.
think early on, those were my early, and I remember having an impression of seeing a Phantom comic in color somewhere, but I can't remember where it was. But it always left an impression on me. Did I like the vibrant colors of the Phantom? I liked the fact you couldn't see his eyes. And there was something just fascinating about him, which again tied in with Fantomas and with Calimán.
Did you get an American newspaper with comic strips in it?
No, we didn't get newspapers in our home. Again, my family were
They probably
they
didn't
didn't
read
get any of
English.
those things. No, we
Yeah.
were very poor and working
Very poor.
class. Family just worked all the time, and I spent a lot of time by myself or with my friends. Bike riding, skateboarding when I had a bike,
Mhm.
into all kinds of mischief and anything really serious. And then my family from Mexico would come and visit, maybe once a year, and they lived in Mexico City, and they were middle class. And so that made a big difference, them being middle class and us not being middle class.
Right.
And so the class issue always resonated with us, because when you come from Mexico, from one of these countries, the class issue is just something that you're able to distinguish it. How people talk, how they dress, the dialects, everything, how they address one another. It's like your place, and
Wow.
you just know it. And so when we came to the States, you were able to tell who the rich people were. Now, they weren't rich; they were upper middle class.
Right.
But we saw them as rich,
But rich from your perspective.
from our perspective. And so those were, and also the way things were segregated in the part of Texas that we lived in, by race, right? And so, but anyway, that's how it was. So books didn't kick in really for me until high school, and then when everything changed.
A Gore Vidal fan. Maybe loves Myra Breckenridge or something.
Oh, Myra was the number one bestseller at the time when it came out.
I stumbled across that book when I was 14. We were staying in someone else's house, and it was on the shelf, and I had no idea who Gore Vidal was or what this. I had no pre-knowledge, and by the time we got to the reveal of what was really going on with Myra
Oh,
Breckenridge,
wow.
I was so shocked.
You read it when you were 14.
Yes, and I was not a sophisticated 14-year-old. I'd read a
Wow.
lot of the Princess of Mars type books, but not much else.
I didn't
Like
read that till
Werewolf
my
by
20s.
Lunchtime.
I didn't read that till my 20s. I think I remember when I read Myra Breckenridge. You were
Yeah.
14. It's quite
I
amazing.
don't think my parents knew what I was reading. It was just on these people's shelves, and I pulled it off and started reading it.
Wow.
I never ripped off Myra for the sleepaway camp ending.
Hmm.
I'm not sure what that means. But one of the parts of childhood is or teenagerhood is encountering books with having no idea what you're encountering in a way.
Mm-hmm. That's where the comics came in. And that's when I mentioned before in other videos, heavy metal came in.
Uh-huh.
The war magazines came in.
Right. You've talked about how you longed to buy the heavy metals, but often you weren't able to. What age are we talking about then? 15,
like
16?
10. Like those
10.
like 10,
oh, wow.
10, 11. Okay. And because what happened was when I began, the arcades began to become popular. And they would show up at convenience stores.
Hello, Borum.
And I was lousy at them, and I would spend all these quarters and just lose. But I like the arcades, but I didn't see the point. But so I would go to the comic. Well, we didn't have a comic shop in this town, but the convenience stores, and I would just look through those comics, and I would look for the artwork that attracted me, and I would try to look for comics that had endings, because I didn't know when comics came out. I didn't know when I was going to have any money. And so because usually I would get money. I mean, we didn't have allowances. Allowances didn't exist for us. And you would ask your parents for money because they didn't have any money. And so I would mow lawns and such, or do jobs for the neighbors down the street. And so I began to see the comics, but the magazines really attracted me. I would see these rows of magazines. And I remember there was wrestling magazines. And I remember liking the Von Erichs, for example. And I used to watch wrestling because wrestling, as you know, in Mexico is extremely popular.
Right.
That's something I haven't discussed. In Mexico, you have the masked, like El Santo,
Mm-hmm.
the Saint, the Blue Demon, Blue Demon, Mil Máscaras, A Thousand Masks. And also those films. They started making those films in the 60s. And where you have El Santo, who's a wrestler by day, but he's really a secret agent. He's like James Bond. So he's got these beautiful women in a tuxedo, and he's got his silver mask. And also those were the toys that we had. So when we came from Mexico, we bought very little. I bought my few comics and a bag of wrestlers, and they were plastic
Mm-hmm.
wrestlers. But there was El Santo, Blue Demon, Mil
Were you
Máscaras.
already able to read the comics? Because I'm assuming you were
In
6
Spanish,
years
I
old.
could read. Yeah, Spanish I could read. Yeah.
So you were. That's interesting that you picked up reading early then in Spanish.
Just the Spanish, but the English,
Right.
English is extremely difficult because Spanish is a very direct language.
Right.
A word generally means what it means. And in English, a word could mean multiple things depending the context, and it's extremely complex.
It is.
And so the comics, so they were already with me. And so when I would go, I would get for the artwork, they would draw me. So the Warren magazines were fantastic for me, eerie, creepy, and such. And then Epic, finally saw Epic magazine.
So, and these were amongst your first English language comics?
They were some of the first.
These
They were
adult
some of the first.
comics.
The adult comics were some of the first. And then when heavy metal got thrown into the convenience store, it was there with the Epics, and I remember looking at it, and of course there's naked girls in there, and of course you want it, and it said there 18 adult. By this point I could read well enough that, and I wondered if they would sell it to me, and so I went up to the counter, and they did, and that's where I discovered Creepax.
And you were 10.
I was 10 or 11 years old. There was Creepax, there was Corbin. I'm not sure if Mobius was in there yet. But for my sake, Creepax was the most important one, and Corbin. And so I could do this for a little bit before they found out. Because one day I went up to the counter.
Right.
The guy looks at me and says, "You can't be buying this." And he looked at me as if I'm some little Damien child. No offense to you. And that I'm buying these things. But I remember saying, but they were over there. As if justifying it. Like, you put it over there so that I could buy it. I didn't argue with him. But it was hopeless. And so every once in a while, and they would show up there, and I would buy them whenever I could. That's where I discovered Ranzerox, for example, by Liberatore. So yes, early on, they came in. So the formative years for me in comics were on 82 and 83. And that's when the X-Men were out. Daredevil was out.
So you moved on from those adult comics to the Marvel comics and DC comics.
That I picked them up, right. And also the DC stuff. I would see Justice League. And I would pick those up as well.
And do you think they helped a lot in getting your English language reading going?
Yeah, they
or
had
were you
to.
already?
No. They did. They had to. And then the odd part was, I don't remember a comics journal at the convenience stores, but I remember Comic Scene and maybe some of the
Comic Scene. I remember that.
And then I remember cutting out, because I remember seeing Mile High Comics and Bud Plant. And you could order the catalogs for free. And those same magazines had advertisements. Again, this was just the way things worked in 82 and 83. There was advertisements for Kirby's, is it Captain Victory?
Yes, Captain Victory.
It was an article on Brian Bolt on the first printing of Judge Dredd with Bolden artwork. There was Nexus. There was Howard Chaykin. There was John Sable Freelance. There was, you see where I'm going with this.
Yes.
And So I'm fairly new for comics, but I'm seeing the artwork here by Chaikin's American Flag. I'm thinking, what is this? I'm seeing John Sable Freelance. What is that? I'm seeing Nexus. What is he doing? And I'm thinking, but the only way I can get this is something about the direct market. I don't know what the direct market was,
Right.
except saying it
So
was
that magazine was your window into the direct market explosion
bingo.
that was happening right then.
Right then, and I got those catalogs in. And at that point, I was mowing a lot of lawns. So I was saved up my money, but then I was trying to convince my mother to write a check for these things. And my problem was not, I mean, I had no idea what they were. I was just looking at the artwork
Right.
and reading and saying this was getting advanced praise by whoever, I think it was Comic Scene or whatever it was. And so what I did, I saved up my money and I ordered these things. And I remember ordered American Flag #1, #2, John Sable Freelance #1, #2, the first few issues of Nexus. And so, and oh yes, and the first issues of Judge Dredd, the reprint with Brian Boland. So when they arrived, I already had been with. Oh yes, and I didn't mention Savage Sword's Conan. I was buying that as well. I was buying Savage Sword's Conan, the magazine, and because I also had sneaked in to see Conan the film as a kid, in the theater. I had snuck in to see it. And I liked the film a lot. And
had you read the books at that point, or
I maybe read one or few short stories, but I knew the magazine. I already knew the magazine,
right?
And so my introduction to this.
Yeah, so at Comic Crack is checking in. You were 12 at this time, Gore. So you were reading at this age the same stuff I was reading in my late teens, early 20s, and thinking, "Wow, comics have really made a huge improvement."
That's about right.
And you were getting that at a much younger age, but
right now I wasn't understanding it at all, and I certainly was not for the American Flag. I was not understanding that.
Right.
John Sable was much more straightforward, and so I was getting these comics in, but then I had a problem because my peers were reading just Daredevil. We're reading just Marvel or DC,
right?
And as you know, at the time, it was like the Protestants and the Catholics.
Yes.
You didn't do both sides. Now, I was the heretic. I did both sides.
I guess it evens it out if I'm in competition.
It's crazy.
I also read The Happy Hooker at that age.
I don't remember Happy Hooker. So I was the heretic in the group because I was reading Marvel and DC. And I didn't see the point why you're a DC or Marvel fan, just exclusively.
Right.
And I was reading all these adult-oriented stuff. And I couldn't really tell people I was reading heavy metal because I would have gotten in serious trouble. And in the few times I would mention American Flag, some of the kids would say, "That's dirty. That's perverse. That's all because it had sex in it."
Right.
And so, and also it's non-superhero.
And if I remember right, you read a lot of Epic at the time.
Yeah, Epic was huge.
And that wasn't as dirty, but it still was kind of sexy.
It was very sexy. Absolutely. I remember there was a John Bolton. John Bolton had a girl, and she was topless, mind you, in the comic. She was topless, and she's swimming, and this octopus woman is embracing her, and have this erotic moment under the sea. And I remember when I bought this, I'm thinking, are they going to tell me I can't buy this? It doesn't say it's not for adults. It doesn't say that.
Right.
But I was afraid they were going to look through it. But they didn't.
So that was easier to buy than heavy metal.
Well, it was easier to buy for the heavy metal.
And I think there was like a bunch of Jeffrey Jones cartoons with
Jones was in there. Bass was in there.
Like his characters never had clothes on, or her characters now.
And so, all that stuff. So I think even before then, and then it was around maybe 83 or so, 84, we moved to a city that had a comic shop. And as soon as I went in, there was Mr. X. There was Love and Rockets. Love and Rockets had just come out.
Wow.
And I wanted Love and Rockets, but at this point, I didn't have enough money to order it. And so, that world opened up completely.
Right. Money is a barrier when you're 12 years old, 13, 14. There's not that many ways to get a hold of money.
Oh, yeah. And the other one was Warrior Magazine. I had ordered a Warrior Magazine.
That was fantastic.
and the one that I got had actual press button on the cover. I did a video about it,
Yeah, I
and
remember that. Yeah.
and I remember I had no idea what Warrior was, but I saw this guy on this cover, and he looked really ruthless. He looked really scary. I had already seen the John Carpenter films. I had seen on HBO. The HBO, remember, on the weekends, every 6 months, it would be for free. And since I was a good Catholic boy, good grades,
Hmm.
good son, the whole shebang, I can watch anything I wanted on HBO.
Oh,
Of course,
that's
my
nice.
parents didn't know what I was watching. So I saw the Carpenter films, Escape from New York. I remember American Gigolo was on. I saw American
Wow.
Gigolo. I saw Cat People, and movies which I still like to this day a lot.
So kids, getting good grades helps you see naughty material.
And being a good altar boy. And so it again, my parents didn't know what I was watching, and also Heavy Metal, the movie, was on HBO. And that one I almost got caught because they were showing. I was watching it, and I had family from Mexico were in town that weekend, and there was a scene where that scene with Dan, where he's
Mhm.
with the girl. I remember I had
Right.
to change the channel. I changed it to something, and they walked in and just pasted and go, and then when they leave the room, just change it back. This was my life with these adult channels, and so anyway, so I was already introduced to this world, right, and the adult world in many ways.
Yes.
But these were the comics that I wanted. This was the stuff that I liked, and then when I began to read and reread it, I got some understanding of it, and so anyway, I went on from here. But yet the books hadn't come in yet. The books were about to come in, and when I was around 17, books like novels and such.
Mhm.
There was 2 books that did everything for me.
So your dad didn't have any hidden material that you dug up or anything?
No, I never knew my dad, and my mom
Oh,
divorced my
I see. Your
father.
dad was not there. Okay.
No, when I was very little, but I know he was a big music fan. My sister would say that he had a huge record collection, and but when it came to reading and such, no, there was no readers in our family. None. It was just me.
Yeah, that was Chris Claremont and John Bolton. John Bolton just was big and then disappeared very quickly.
I know he was wonderful. Yeah, I think it was the She Wolf.
Yeah,
I think it was a
yeah.
She Wolf
That
story
Gary's
from.
mentioning here.
Okay.
And while we're pausing, I'll say hi to a few people I didn't get to say hi to.
Yeah, I really can't see without my
Travis.
glasses. I really can't see who's showing up. I should put on my glasses. I don't know
And
if you guys are Gary. I
so
saw
Travis
Chris.
Bueller is here. Terrence, of course, we've said hi to.
Yeah,
Chris
Terrence.
has been very active. He got a hold of his dad's penthouses,
Well,
I think.
I did not get the penthouse stuff when I was that age.
And Werewolf got a few Playboys. I my dad had some hidden Playboys, and he had the Happy Hooker. But he's a hypocrite because at age, I think when I was 16 or something, or 17, he found my early heavy metals because I started reading heavy metal in 77 when it came out. So he must have thrown them out in 78.
I think you remember in one of your videos that they were thrown out.
Yeah, and I looked in my closet one day and they were just all gone. And I said, "What's happened here? You threw my comics out." And he said, "Those weren't comics; those were dirty magazines." And so all the Catholicism came from my dad. He gave me lectures, that you would go to hell if you masturbated and things like that.
Yeah, I remember that's what it was because I remember at the I think what did for us I remember there was 2 priests from Spain. Again, imagine Lone Star, small text, and you had 2 from Spain, and there was one that was older, that was younger. The older one day he was talking to us and the students, and I remember he said, if you kiss a boy or you kiss a girl, you're committing a mortal sin. Those of you who are not Catholics, there's different levels of sin. Mortal's the one that if you die before confession, chances are you might go to hell. Strong chances you're going to go to hell, but it's mortal. And when he said that, one of the girls, forget who it was a very brave child. She interrupted him. She raised her hand and says, "How is this a sin, Father?" These are elementary school kids, mind you.
Right.
And goes, "How is this a sin? If I kissed my boyfriend, He goes, "Have you kissed your boyfriend?" "Yes." "You are committing a sin." She goes, "Why am I committing a sin?" "Because of the thoughts." And he was a fire and brim. He was Old Testament. But we
How
also
did he
had a
even know what that little girl's thoughts were?
apparently he did, I suppose. And so now we had another priest from Spain who was New Testament. Now he was younger, and we always felt bad for him because he would, on the one time he had, because the priest lived there on campus. We did not, we had to, we just went there. But he would play soccer. He would play like racquetball against the church wall by himself. And all of us would wait for the bell to ring so we could just rush him and force him to play soccer with us. And I think this was his time, but we would take up his time. Now he's ever said no to us, but in retrospect, I think he wanted to be by himself because he never really had time for himself.
Right.
Now all the girls had a crush on him because he was a very good-looking priest. And also the confessionals were different with him. We didn't have to go into that little room, the confessional. The way we would confess would be by the altar. We would come in through the back, wait all on the back, and then walk all the way to the front and one or two pews, and we would sit with him eye to eye, and he would confess us. And no matter what we told him, he wouldn't be harsh with us. And he would give us the Hail Marys and the Our Fathers and such. And again, he was very New Testament with us. He didn't stay long. I remember one year he was gone. I never knew why. But that's the way it would work sometimes. Priests would be there and they would leave. And then we moved around. And as far as I know, there was never an issue with a priest at our school, to my knowledge. It could have been at one point.
Mm-hmm.
If I didn't
But not
know.
that you heard about.
When I was there was never an issue. And I was
Mhm.
around them all the time. And there was never an issue with any of them, except you can tell that some of them were not happy that they were there.
Yeah.
Maybe you were right, Damien. They're unhappy being priest. And I think it's partly true because if you are a priest, you're a man of God, of faith, no matter where you are. You can be in Rome, you can be in Paris, or in some town that has a population of 10 people. It doesn't matter, right? A soul is a soul. Your job is to do this.
Right.
It doesn't matter, right? So I think they were just unhappy what they were doing. But this particular priest, this young one, was not. And so he always had a really good impression with me. So anyway, so all this tied in with Daredevil, right? So when the Daredevil books came out, I immediately recognized what Frank Miller was doing. And then when he left the book and came back with Born Again, oh my God, Born Again! What can you say about that? I mean, it's washed over with Roman Catholicism, right?
Right.
And it's one of my favorite stuff by Frank and Mazzucchelli.
I have to say the priests, at least by the time I was a teenager, were much more liberal than my dad was. And it was a bit embarrassing to go confess to them things my dad felt were sins that I had suspected strongly the priest did not think were sins. We have a lot of sinners in this chat.
I would hope so.
But
I think they're better people for it.
I mean, we've always known that Terrence Comic Crack is a sinner, but
that's why he's such a good person.
we haven't seen Ragamuffin in a long time. That is kind of cool. He used to be a regular on the live show that with Terrence and Rasa, but I haven't heard from him in a long time. So that's great that you're still alive and well, Ragamuffin. So for me, long before Daredevil, my Catholic reading was Graham Greene. Brighton Rock, I think, was the one where they constantly discussed, could you confess your sins and get forgiveness between the falling off the saddle and hitting the ground and dying? And
he was
I used to worry about that kind of stuff a lot.
He was a convert, correct, Graham Greene?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he was a convert to Catholicism.
And I think ultimately he was a big sinner himself, with lots of mistresses and betrayals and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, Greene is one of my favorite writers from that generation. And And Brighton Rock I read later.
Mhm.
And the first one that I read by him, I want to say, was The End of the Affair, which made it a really good film with Julianne Moore. And but Green is yeah, he's a writer that I like very much. It's he's got a similarity to Matt Murdock, is that his characters is their Achilles heel is their conscience. At one point
Right.
it kicks in. And when that happens, it's either they're gonna die or someone they care about is gonna die. I remember a friend of mine, he was in an airport and I was in Houston. It was again in the 80s. And he said Graham Greene was on the plane, but he
Oh,
couldn't get off because at that point he had been, I think, the Reagan administration, because he had been a supporter, I think, of Castro and of communist regimes. So he had been like on the list. So he couldn't, because my friend was on the plane with him. He couldn't get off the plane. And, I mean, he wasn't coming to America. It was going to another country, but he couldn't get off just to go to the terminal because of that.
wow.
And
Wow.
because again, he had been listed as not as a communist, but I forget what it
A
was.
sympathizer of Castro or suspected of
Yeah, something as national
spying.
security sort of thing. I know
Yeah.
Garcia Marquez had the same issues at one point.
I know that Garcia Marquez was friendly with Castro.
Oh yeah, he supported to the end, and that was an issue between him and the great Peruvian writer Mario Vargas Llosa.
Llosa
And
was not pro
he was
Castro.
not, and this created a rift between them. And it never had an issue with Carlos Fuentes. Carlos and because Carlos was also supportive of the Castro regime, as many of them were from that generation. Because initially it was something for the good. It didn't turn out that way. And but Castro, but anyway, but Carlos and Marquez always had good relations, and as far as I know, Carlos and Mario always had a good relation. Now I
Uh-huh.
speak these writers by first name because they became important writers to me once I discovered books.
So were they amongst the early ones in the prose world that
Oh
really captured
no,
you?
not at all.
Who so you got into comics, you tried things like Tarzan, but it didn't really
No.
capture you, and then comics really captured you, and then what brought you in back to prose?
Well, what brought me to prose were these two books
Wuthering Heights,
and Shakespeare's Hamlet.
Hamlet. Wow, I hate Hamlet.
I
Sorry,
hate Hamlet. Well, but
but
maybe
in
I,
general, I like Shakespeare. But I don't
yeah.
know. Hamlet has always been one of my least favorites.
Well, what happened here with these two, these are not the original copies. I was looking for my original copy of Wuthering Heights, which I still
Hmm.
have. I couldn't find it. It's somewhere here. And this is not my original Hamlet.
So when did you encounter these books?
17, 18.
17, 18.
And I
Okay.
remember being angry because I was pretty angry because of Wuthering Heights. We had to buy the book,
Thanks, Gary.
and we had to buy the book. And I thought it was some sentimental romance. Now, up until this time, I did like love stories, and especially I had watched a lot of Mexican films from the 40s and 50s, and many of them are love stories. I just liked them, and if they were tragic, I liked them even more.
Hmm.
So I thought Wuthering Heights was some sentimental drivel, and I remember I had to go buy the book, and we went and bought it. And I didn't want to read it. I was just so upset about it. But I had to read it for school. And as you know, it's a very difficult book because it's told from various points of view. And also some of the way they talk, the dialect is difficult. Now, my English was fine, but it's a complicated book to read because of the time
Yeah.
fluctuations. But I began to read it, and then our teacher showed us the Laurence Olivier film.
Hmm.
And I do remember that scene in the movie and reading in the book when Kathy tells Heath, when Kathy is going to marry, I think one of the Earnshaws, Lipton, and she's talking to the servant of the household, saying, "I'm going to get married." She goes, "Do you love this man?" She goes, "No, I love Heathcliff." And she goes, "Then why are you marrying him?" And she goes, I can't marry Heathcliff. It would be beneath me. And she doesn't know that Heathcliff is listening to this conversation. Now, I spoke earlier about class being central to our upbringing.
Right.
So with this book, the class issue made perfect sense to me. And Heathcliff leaves, but Kathy continues to talk about her passion for Heathcliff as something almost like primordial. And she's hoping to marry, basically, she's going to use this man to bring up Heathcliff. But Heathcliff is
Right.
already gone. You know, up until this time, Heathcliff has been treated horribly by her brother. Absolutely horribly. And then years pass, and Heathcliff comes back. And he comes back. His English is perfect. He's very sophisticated. And I remember that part there in the movie and in the book just struck me. And I like Kathy. And I understood what Kathy meant. But I understood Heathcliff. And I understood why Heathcliff was hurt and why he's back and he's pissed off and he wants revenge. But he wants Kathy. And the novel really just, you know, it's just, it is a tragic book, what happens to these characters and everyone around them.
Right.
But when I read that, I had already read, by this point, I had read Matt Wagner's Grendel. So I was already knew the anti-hero, at least in comics, right?
Right.
And I had, you know, I mentioned some of these other independent comics, so I was already in that environment. And the movies that I liked, you already had people like this. So these were the type of characters that I liked. So here was Heathcliff and Kathy, and I wanted more books like this. And that same year, we read Hamlet. Again, these are difficult books.
They are. They're especially Hamlet, but
Especially Hamlet.
Both are it's a dense reading experience. The language is not modern language in either of them.
It was very difficult, especially since I wasn't a regular reader. But Hamlet, why he came back, how he's thinking, how he plots to take revenge for the death of his father, and Shakespeare's words, where you study the words, you study the line, you study the paragraph, and you think about it. Suddenly, these characters, Hamlet, Heathcliff, and Kathy, like some of the comic people that I liked, these were the books that I wanted to read. As difficult as they were, the language, the settings, the periods, I knew very little about. Didn't matter. I wanted books like this. And that from there on, it made me a book reader. Because what I did right after that was this. Let me show you. I still have some of these. These were when I was young or around that same age. I went to a used bookstore and I did something I don't recommend anyone to do. I went from letter A to letter
Wow.
Z.
I think you mentioned this in a long past video.
I think I'm sorry I haven't mentioned it again.
No, it was so long ago that I want to hear it again. I'm just
remember
vaguely remembering you mentioning A to Z.
A to Z, and because at this point I couldn't tell you the difference between Jackie Collins, Clancy, Stephen King, Norman Mailer, Gore Vidal, Joyce Carol Oates. I couldn't tell you. I didn't know who were the good writers, quote unquote good writers, who were not. But I knew I wanted books like this, so I went to the part that had all these paperbacks, and they were considered the literature books. It said literature, right? And that's where Wuthering Heights fell under. And mind you, I had no one to guide me.
Right.
So what I did was I went through A through Z, and I went through every one of those books, and I would turn them to the back. And most of them were Penguin books, just like this. And I began to read what was the stories about. When I got to the F, I got to Flaubert. Sentimental Education, about a young man who falls in love with an older woman. Bought it. This is the original copy. I got to letter L, Lawrence. D.H. Lawrence.
Uh-huh.
The Rainbow. Sons and Lovers, about a man's relationship with his mom. And I was very close to my mother. And working in the coal mine. And Women in Love. When I got to Z, I got to Zola. This is Nana. Now, this probably ties into my heavy metal Valentina world. She's a prostitute.
And that cover, was that the cover at the time?
No, this was one of those penguin. I forget who did this painting. Probably
That's
some
quite
painting.
a cover.
So these are just some of the books, right? And for the S, I got Stendhal, the Red and the Black, which is about a young man who's poor during the era of Napoleon. And what does he do? Either the church or you become a soldier.
Mm-hmm.
He becomes a soldier, eventually joins the church. And his name was Julian. Now, I already know the name Julian. Why? Because I had seen American Gigolo. So, and that character, I was fascinated in American Gigolo.
So movies also influenced your interest in reading books.
Yeah. So I had these lists
of something people don't think of usually.
No. And so all these, now, mind you, I had no idea that Lawrence, Flaubert, Zola, Stendhal, I skipped Dickens. I don't know how that happens. I skipped Balzac. I don't know how that happened. I got to Balzac later. And so I went through these lists, not knowing that these writers were important writers.
So it was just a good radar for books that got you those books.
Good radar, just like it was for comics in the early 80s. I had no idea Love and Rockets was going to be.
So are we still in the 17, 18-year-old range, or are you getting a little?
It is 17. There's all 17.
Wow. All 17. Wow.
All 17.
Those
18.
are intense books at 17.
Intense books, and obviously I had difficulty reading them. I mean, what did I know about England in the late 1800s? And I didn't know anything. And so I jumped into that. And then I moved away. I moved to Austin, the capital. Austin's capital of Texas.
Back in the good old days, when Austin was cool.
Back in the good old days. And when I got to Austin, okay. Well, now regarding the comics, though, by this point, once I discovered these books, my interest in comics really began to wane. And I mean, there was comics that were literary, that were adult, that were like this, but my fascination with these books really took me away from the comics.
Mm-hmm.
And also, it was the late 80s when the comics, Marvel and DC, for example, went to that new color where the pages were all nice and shiny.
On the Baxter paper. Yeah.
Right. And nice and shiny. Some of the artists that I liked were no longer doing stuff for them.
Mm-hmm.
And so I just was an interest, certainly with the superhero comics.
Can I just interject here? Was this kind of reading you were doing after growing up in a small town, being quite poor? Was there like an excitement were you discovering a different world?
Oh, yeah. There was a huge excitement, and I couldn't there was no one for me to talk about it with anybody. Right. But that didn't really matter. I was talking basically to myself and the books.
Mm-hmm.
And it was definitely just like that. And this entirely new world, which I had briefly discovered in the magazines and the comics, on HBO when I could see those movies that I wanted to see. And then with these books. And by the late 80s, when this was beginning to happen, one of the few comics that I was reading, Hellblazer, had come out.
Mm-hmm.
And I was reading that. I was reading Doom Patrol by Grant Morrison. And but I was definitely moving away from the comics. And the books took center stage. And when I'm living in Austin, there were so many used bookstores at the time in Austin. Not just that, but I lived in Houston later on. Remember the movie Hannah and Her Sisters?
Oh, yeah. I loved that movie at the time.
Do you remember when Michael Caine goes to see not Mia Farrow's sister. I forget the actress's name.
Right. Was it Barbara Hershey or
Barbara
something?
Hershey. And they go into that bookstore and he finds the E. Cummings books, the poetry.
Right.
Those were the bookstores. They were commonplace
Yeah.
in Austin and in Houston.
Portland was like that when I moved here. There was used bookstores every few blocks, it seemed.
But
They're
those
all
type of
gone
used
now.
bookstores, right? Where you have stacks of books everywhere, but it tend to be the non-genre books,
Yes, they do.
right?
Yeah.
And so those were the books. So when I would go into these places, and by this point, once I discovered Lawrence, that led me to Henry Miller.
I think Diane Wiest was the other sister, but
It
not
was
the
the other
one.
sister.
Not the one that Michael Caine was having an affair with.
No, it was the other sister. That's the one that Woody Allen's character eventually hooks up with.
Right. It's a fantastic movie. I should rewatch it.
I watched it a lot. I saw it in Austin in the theater at the time. And that was another thing about living in Austin. Austin showed foreign films in large numbers.
Right.
And
That's another
already,
thing I associate with you is the foreign art movies, so to speak.
I mean, I like the mainstream stuff as anybody else, but I wanted something more. And so suddenly there was all these that showed all these foreign movies. And I was there continuously for those movies. I mean, Wings of Desire, Wim Wenders.
That's an incredible one, yeah.
Which led me to Rilke, the poet, because Rilke's angels were the ones that inspired that. And Rilke became one of my favorite poets at the time. So all these movies began to just fluctuate.
So you jumped into poetry also.
Poetry, absolutely. Jumped really on. Rilke was one of the first. Neruda was one of the first. Pablo Neruda was one of the first. So basically, I'm going all around, but I haven't gotten to the Latin American writers. Basically, what happened once these books opened, because once this one led to Henry Miller. Henry Miller led to Hemingway, because you start reading who influenced who. Right. When I picked up a Henry Miller book, Henry Miller influenced by Lawrence. I knew Lawrence.
Yeah, I went from Aeneas Nin to Henry Miller.
Oh, okay, right. Okay, there we go.
Because Aeneas Nin was a big deal. It was someone assigned to me in college, and I was like,
diaries were assigned.
Yeah, and I was like, this other person in the diaries, Henry Miller, sounds more interesting than Aeneas Nin to me.
Did you see Henry in June?
A long time ago, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, well,
I went through a whole Henry Miller phase, maybe when I was 20 or something. But
I went through. I read Sexus, Plexus, Tropic of Cancer, Tropic of
Capricorn, Black Box, I think one was called.
I jumped all that in.
Yeah.
And then when I was there, and some of the writers, that's why I discovered Story of O. That's when I discovered Robbe-Grillet. That's when I discovered Duras, who wrote The Lover, who Armuccio Francilia is a huge fan of. Because what was happening already, once you get some kind of foundation, right, with these guys, and you start seeing all these writers who were influenced by them or knew them, then you pick up those writers.
Right.
And so I was just...
Now, were you working, or were you in college, or?
I was in university. I was a government major.
Okay.
I was around government people, law enforcement people.
So you were, in all your spare time, you were just searching out new books.
This was just it. And I remember I quickly befriended the philosophy majors, the English majors.
Mm-hmm.
And I would take a few English classes. And, but I didn't switch majors because what I said was, I do this for fun.
Yeah, it could ruin it for you if you have to write papers.
Well, you know, I remember they would come out of there, right? And they would say, "What are you guys reading?" "Oh, we're reading this Thomas Hardy novel. We can't stand it." I haven't read Hardy yet.
Right.
"Oh, we're reading this John Fowles book, French Lieutenant's Woman. It's like the worst." And I go, "What are you reading?" I'm reading Henry Miller. I'm reading Stendhal. I'm reading Flaubert. You know, because Flaubert, you know, led me to Madame Bovary.
Right.
Right. And with Lawrence, I didn't get to Lady Chatterley till years later.
But you had read all those other ones.
Yeah. No, because I had already seen Lady Chatterley as a kid when it was on HBO.
Oh.
And so I just didn't think I wanted to bother seeing it. So what was happening is these poor English majors were being forced to read books. Now,
Right.
by the late 90s, I became an admirer of John Fowles. And John Fowles, French Lieutenant's Woman, The Magus, The Collector, which was made into a
Yeah.
movie
I
with Terry
haven't read any
Stanton.
of him.
No, you
And
haven't done Fowles?
he certainly fell out of fashion. You never hear about him anymore. But
No, he's definitely out.
yeah, I
And
always wanted to read The Magus, but I just
The Magus
gave
is
up.
excellent. It was made into a good film with Michael Caine and with
Huh. I didn't know that.
I forget who was the girl? Who was the woman who had that show? She was a reporter in the late 80s. She was married to Louis Malle, the director Louis Malle.
Oh, Louis Malle. I
Candice
remember
Bergen.
him. Oh, Candice Bergman. Oh, I see. She was played the reporter. Yeah.
Yeah, what was the name of that show?
Murphy Brown.
Murphy Brown.
Yes.
And like,
Right. She was hot stuff long before Murphy Brown as a sex symbol.
yeah, she was. I mean, she was pretty hot in the Magus. And so those writers, then when I was ready, I read them on my own, and I liked them. And so, I mean, if you're a government major, I mean, you're not going to read statutes or the Constitution for fun.
Right.
You know, you're not going to read all these laws for fun. You know,
You
you're
know,
going
I
to
think
make.
for most people, you love the books as you discover in your own time much
Yeah.
more.
So I just happened to be around that circle, around people, very literary people. But then I was around this other group of people, the political people, the law enforcement people. So also politically, you know, both groups were one very conservative, one obviously liberal.
Right.
But I could converse with both quite easily without any issues. But either group could understand what I saw with this quote unquote weird group, and this group couldn't understand what I was doing with these
Right.
fascists. But again, it goes back to Marvel and DC, Protestants and Catholics.
Right.
I mean, really? And
Right. You've never fallen in with these groups.
no.
So speaking of groups that are sometimes outsiders, you haven't mentioned science fiction yet, which I know you've read a lot of science fiction.
Mm-hmm.
Was that at the same time? Was that in with the sort of high literary stuff that you were
No.
falling in with?
The movies were. I mean, I liked the movies. I remember Silent Running
Mm-hmm.
was one of the ones I saw when I was a kid. Remember that beautiful film with Bruce Stern?
Yes, that was a wonderful movie.
And 2001, I didn't see till I was older. But I liked the Planet of the Apes films.
Oh,
We're
God,
talking
yeah, I
about
love
the
those.
films.
Yeah.
Yeah, his first the films, right?
Yeah.
And I like the Twilight Zone episodes. I like Space 1999. I like Star Trek. And so and especially the Star Trek films. The first one in particular is probably still my favorite.
Oh, really? You're in the minority there, I think.
I'm in the minority on that one because even when I watch it now, it's about what the universe. Because the Wrath of Khan,
Mm-hmm.
everyone can understand that, but
Right.
the first one is how it's one of those things. Whenever you discover a new nebula or some new black hole or something that's odd in the universe, you're thinking we really know nothing about this universe, and that's why I like the first Star Trek. Because it's something, and I think Arthur C. Clarke, had something to do with it. I think the advising Robert Wise, the director of that film, in the making of that. And
I can see that it had a very Arthur C. Clarke vibe.
yeah, I'm almost sure he had something to do with that film. And I like just the idea of, even as a kid, it baffled me, the idea of the whole thing. And so that's why it makes it still my favorite. With Wrath of Khan is really really close. The science fiction stuff, I would read it off and on, here and there would come in, and this would have been in the early 90s. And I don't know who was the science fiction writer that grabbed me first. It wasn't Asimov, for sure. It wasn't Asimov. It was
Ballard?
not. It might have been probably Bradbury.
Okay, that makes sense.
It might have been Bradbury, who's like considered the poet of science fiction, right?
Right.
And it might have been Bradbury, or it might have been Ballard.
I feel like I've heard you mention Ballard quite a bit over the years.
Yeah, Ballard became very important. I have a lot of Ballard stuff. I'm pointing over there to my bookshelf. That's a
For
joke.
those who don't know, his most famous book would be Empire of the Sun because Steven Spielberg made a movie of it.
With a young
But
Christian Bale.
J.G. Ballard was an extremely unusual but influential British science fiction writer. I feel like some people don't know who he is, so I just thought I'd put that in there.
He's never been popular in the States. I run
Yeah.
into very few people that know him over the decades, Ballard. I think he's just well known everywhere else but here, I think, in a sense. And
Yeah,
even
you
when
find if you travel in the inner circles of science fiction, his short fiction was extremely influential
okay.
on short fiction writers in the U.S., but that's a very tiny microcosm.
But the science fiction came much later. I was already much older when it came to science fiction.
Yes, he did write Crash too. Okay, so that's unusual because a lot of people they go from science fiction to the more literary books often.
I guess for me, it
At
would
least
be
that
the
was my
comics, I
journey.
suppose. I guess the science fiction comics that I read when I was a kid, I suppose. And because you're right, it does. Because it inspires you when you read. Because it's true when you
Right.
read like a Bradbury story or an Arthur C. Clarke story, and there's something about how they write those things, those little condensed spaces. It really just inspires the imagination that you can go from that to just about anything. It's almost like a coffee rush when you read one of them. I mean, with Bradbury, his beautiful story, which is in the Illustrated Man called Kaleidoscope, which is about a space shuttle that gets ripped apart by a meteor shower, and
That
all
rings a
the
bell.
astronauts are thrown into space. And you get a paragraph for one of them heading into the sun, another one into the earth, another one into the void, another one into an asteroid belt. They have limited amount of oxygen. There's no way they can be rescued in time. And you feel it. And it's just absolutely heartbreaking. And you were going to talk about this, and where do I have that? This book here, when I read it, The Martian Chronicles.
Uh-huh.
I remember that from the early 80s, there was a miniseries of
Right.
this.
So is that the tie-in version?
No, this is
no?
one of the early editions that was
Uh-huh.
published. This is
Were you already familiar with Bradbury when the TV show came out, or did that
no,
lead
the
you
TV
into
show was new
Bradbury?
to me.
So the Martian Chronicles your first Bradbury?
My first Bradbury was the Martian Chronicles. Yeah. And this one I think has is it Christopher Isherwood? Yeah. This one has a blurb by Christopher Isherwood.
Wow.
I know, who was a big fan of this book, which when I got this, Christopher. Yeah. See, I knew Christopher Isherwood before, and you basically had read a bunch of Bradbury.
And I had read all the Bradbury before I ever even heard of Christopher Isherwood.
Isherwood, right? I know he was a friend of Vidal's. And
I don't know about Gore, Gary, but I read a lot of both of those guys. H. Rider Haggard seems like a huge influence on Edgar Rice Burroughs and Robert E. Howard to me.
Probably, the writer he wrote She
and King Solomon's Mines.
Bingo. Those are the ones, yeah.
Those were good books, but I'm sure they're very racist, but I remember enjoying them a lot.
See, I read those books already when I was years later. I read some of those, and so what happened, I mean, again, who came first? So, but then I read Bradbury, a lot of his short stories.
Right.
And the Martian Chronicles is just so wonderfully sad, especially the ending, if you remember the ending.
It's so long. I just remember bits and pieces of, somehow the Midwest was transferred to Mars in a lot of stories, but I can't remember.
I mean, one of the stories which takes place in the segregated South, and you see all the African Americans going into a rocket because they're leaving. They're going to go live on Mars. No, the ending of the book is when the population of Mars, just like the Native Americans, have been erased. At one point, a little boy looks into a pond, and his dad's behind him and says, "Who are the Martians?" And the dad says, "You're looking at them." Now they're the Martians.
Right.
Mars. And
I did not understand when I read that. I did not get the metaphor. I mean, we're the Americans, right? We say we're the Americans.
Yeah.
The way they were saying they're the Martians, but anyway.
Well, exactly. And so I'm not sure regarding them, and regarding Ballard, for example. I'm not sure if it was Crash. The first thing I read by him might have been Crash, and this is before the Cronenberg film came out.
Yeah.
And then I began to read High Rise, Crash, his many of his novels, Empire of the Sun, his short stories. I think I've read a huge chunk of his short stories. I had that one here somewhere to show you. It's somewhere around here. And yeah, this. No, it's not here. Anyway, so Ballard, and at one point Michael Moorcock entered the picture. Ellison entered.
The more sword and sorcery Michael Moorcock, or the more sort of literary sci-fi Michael Moorcock?
No, the Ulrich stuff, and some of the Ulrich stuff, and some of his and the Jerry Cornelius stuff. And that would have been around the 2000s. That would have been so I came late to him.
Wow.
And
so you're inverse of me. I read all that stuff between
Yeah.
the ages of 12 and 17 or something, and then I became all pretentious and would only read Hemingway and stuff like that. And then I came back to science fiction when I was about 25 or something.
No, I don't think it's pretentious. I think it. I think I know what you mean, though, in the sense that I may have gone through that too when I just focused on these books.
Right.
Because I remember in the 90s, I stopped reading comics. I would sometimes go into a comic shop and look for the European stuff, try to find Krepak stuff, Corbin stuff, Mobius stuff, and it didn't happen very often. But I was going into those used bookstores, like I said, from like we saw in
Austin.
In Austin, right? And I remember one day, it was one particular bookstore I would walk in, and they had the first edition of Nabokov, became a favorite writer of mine. And there was a collection of his translation of Eugene Vonnegut by Pushkin.
I've never read any of that. Barely know what that is, but
yeah, Vonnegut was Pushkin was one of Russia's greatest poets.
Right. I've heard the name, but I haven't ever read any Pushkin or heard much about him, really.
He was very much like Byron. He died young. He died in a duel. A very romantic figure.
Just when I said pretentious, I was meaning myself was being pretentious, thinking I had outgrown science fiction, the same way I thought I outgrew comics at one point. I'm not saying that either form was pretentious, but sorry to interrupt.
No, you're fine. And I would come in, and the thing is, what happens is with the comics, book dealers know us, and they know the buyers. And I would walk in one day, and these Pushkin books were very expensive. They're nice hardbacks. It was 3 volumes. Again, translated by Nabokov with his notes. And I would come in, and I was pat it, and I would go and talk to the guys, the owners, and buy a book or two. One day I come in, the books are gone. I'm thinking, what the heck? Where is he? And the guys were all happy. It got sold. Who the hell bought it? I was pretty angry. And they said, McMurtry. Larry McMurtry? What is he doing with this? Oh, man, he came in, he cleaned this out. He bought this, he bought that, he bought this. Lonesome Dove, Larry McMurtry. Horseman Passed By, Larry McMurtry. The Last Picture Show, Larry McMurtry. I'm never reading any of his books again. Why did he buy those damn books? And they said, well, don't you know he's got a bookstore up in Archer City? That's where he lives. And I go, well, what do you mean he has a bookstore? He goes around the country. He buys books. He's a big book lover. He buys some for his shop so he can sell, but he reads them. So he bought my Nabokov. And that's when I learned about McMurtry, that Larry McMurtry would do this. And he died a few years ago. I think I never got to visit those bookstores. They're still in existence. There's like 3 giant ones in that city.
I think Michael Moorcock lives in Texas. Sorry to.
Yes, Michael Moorcock.
He's alive and in Texas. Who would think he would live there?
Okay, the thing about Michael, McMurtry up to Michael, is that he moved there in the 90s. When I didn't know he lived there.
Right. He's so British, or at least in my mind, he's so British.
Yeah, he's British. The reason he moved there is because I think his wife is American, I think. And at one point, he had to move down here because of health care. I think had something to do with either his mom, I mean his wife, or someone in his wife's family, and the medical care.
Hmm.
And that's the reason they moved here. But he had moved away, and so I guess he's back.
Oh,
I guess he's back. I didn't know that, but it was near Austin. But it's good to know that he's back. Maybe I could finally go to meet him.
he must be quite elderly now.
He must be in his 80s, I think, because when
Yeah.
he was editing what New Worlds,
I
whatever
think
that
he
was,
started editing it in maybe 1959, 1960, something like
he
that.
was like a little Jim Shooter in the
Right.
sense
He
that he
was a
was a kid.
teenager when he took over
Yeah.
New Worlds.
Yeah, when Jim Shooter was doing what Legion of
Yeah.
Superheroes, he was doing this guy.
And
And
he was one of those editors that created a movement, right? He kind of masterminded the British new wave of science fiction.
yeah, he brought in Ballard, he brought in Harlan. I'm not
Mhm.
sure, was Silverberg already around?
Yeah, Silverberg was a hack in the 50s and then became kind of a literary writer in the 60s.
Okay.
And he
Um,
brought in a lot of British people whose names now elude me, but if one looks back at the history of the new wave of science fiction, it was pretty much his creation.
Appreciation. So was that?
Gary says he's 83.
Oh wow, I thought he was older for some reason.
Yeah. Well, I think because he started editing as a teenager somehow. I don't know how he did that, but
You know, those Jerry Cornelius books are so wonderfully amoral. I
uh-huh.
mean, he has sex with his sister. I think at one point he has sex with his mom.
Right.
I mean, it's all kinds of craziness in that book, and it always makes me smile
Yeah.
when I get
There
somebody.
was a period where where the taboo against incest seemed to be wearing away for a while, but
Um,
anyway, I don't know what to do with that. But I read some of the Jerry Cornelius when I was like 14, and it went
wow.
right over my head. I didn't. I preferred the Elric at the time, so maybe I should try it again.
Yeah, I think you might like it
And
now. I
Behold
mean,
the Man. I don't know if Behold the Man was Jerry Cornelius, but it was in that sort of hippie vein of
no, it
science
wasn't
fiction.
Jerry Cornelius, but it was Moorcock about a man who travels back in time to
Right.
witness the crucifixion.
And there was a lot of masturbating or something in that book, which again was weird for me to read when I was being told by my father I was going to go to hell for it.
Mischief. Um, but
Yes, Whose Goes There, which became The Thing, the movie The Thing. Yeah.
the one thing about the bookstores that was happening in the 90s, or like the early 80s, I mean, late 80s, early 90s, was when I would go to them. I was still relatively young. And I began to buy these nice books.
Hmm.
And I mean, I remember James Joyce became important to me. I mean, I read Dubliners, Portrait of the Artist, and I spent a whole month reading Ulysses. Um, but I was looking for nice editions of these books, not first editions. I couldn't
Right.
afford them.
So
But
when you read Ulysses, did you look at somebody's annotation of it or
Mhm.
explanation of it?
I did, which was a mistake because that's why it
Oh,
probably took me a month to read it.
oh, okay.
Because I remember I was disciplined about it, and I went to my library. It was my book, and I had the book and the annotations up here, and which is in the sense that I know that when Alan Moore did From Hell,
Hmm.
later on he published the annotations. It's probably a mistake to read it back and forth because you're going
Right.
to take forever to read it. Maybe just read it straightforward and then do the annotations.
That makes sense. Yeah.
I didn't do that with Ulysses, and so I mean I like the book, and it's one of my favorite books to this day. But reading it that way was a huge mistake, and because it almost became like a chore to read it, which it shouldn't have been.
Right.
Now, I wasn't doing it for a class; I was doing it because I wanted to read it. I like Portrait, I like Dubliners, I liked it. I liked those books immensely. And this was the big tome. This was the big monster, Ulysses. And and I remember buying it from a nice bookstore. And then when I finished it, Finnegan's Wake. And so I remember when I bought it, I bought the Finnegan's Wake book.
Did you actually read it?
I still have it, and the answer is no.
Okay.
And You remember
I
when
think I've only read the first page, and I was like, "Whoa!"
No, you remember when Joseph Campbell came out with The Power of Myth?
Yes, yes, and he was on. They'd made a PBS show about him and everything.
So I watched that, and that's when I learned who Joseph Campbell was. And then I learned he had written a book about Finnegan's Wake.
Oh, I didn't realize he did that.
So basically, not exactly annotated, but basically it explains the whole thing. So I watched Power of Myth, enjoyed it immensely, and so I began to buy books by Campbell, including the book on Finnegan's Wake, because in the series he mentions Joyce quite a bit, and so, but to this day, I mean that book is one day I'll read it, maybe not, but I still have it. But my point about this bookstores was one thing I noticed early on was that everyone there was older than me who were buying these books. And I remember talking to the dealers. The dealers liked me because I was young. But the thing is, there was no regeneration happening. And people that were there much older than me looking for nice copies of, John Fowles, Bukowski, Paul Bowles. And you recognize these writers.
Yes.
Carson McCullers, Norman Mailer, Gore Vidal, Philip Roth, and appreciating nice first editions of whatever, right? Paying top dollar for them, $50, $80, $100, $200 for these things.
Wow.
I was one of those. And
so you were buying collectible books, not just the cheapest paperback copy you could find.
Yeah, I was fine because once I really liked those books. I remember when Milan Kundera's The Unbearable Lightness of Being came out. That would have been in the late 80s. A friend of mine gave me a copy of the book because somehow, I don't know how this happened, it became a book club edition. It baffles me how that happened. And the movie...
Was it because of the movie, maybe?
I think it must have been because when the movie came out, a friend gave me the book. And so I went to see the film. And it was my introduction to Juliette Binoche. And I think at an unconscious level, she was Valentina from Creepax. Because when I watched her on screen, I was completely mesmerized. And there's Daniel Day-Lewis. Beautiful film.
So you saw the film first in this case?
It was, no, I read the book.
You read the book first and then saw the film.
And then the film. But the film, because of Juliette Binoche, and partly because of Valentina's Creepax, made me probably like the whole thing even more.
Okay.
So years later, when I went to a collector's bookstore, at this point you had to call them for an appointment.
That was serious.
There was a serious bookstore, and I called them and I said, "What are you looking for?" I'm looking for the first edition of The Unbearable Lightness of Being. So I showed up. The guy showed up. Now he already knew me because a few years earlier he had another bookstore, and he's the one who sold me Finnegan's Wake. So I went in there and I bought my copy. And the copy was not perfect condition. It had a clip. The price had been clipped, which is the big no-no. And dust jackets are important in these books.
Right. If you lose the dust jacket, you lose a lot of the value, right?
Huge value, right?
Yeah.
And but I paid like $50 for it, which for me was a lot. And now you can find that first edition on eBay like for $2. I mean, it's fascinating how these things have just collapsed.
Well, yeah, I've been talking about that with one of the few used bookstores still left in my neighborhood, and she said that there's a huge change in the value of books once you could search the whole world for a book instead of just your town or something.
Yet everything collapsed, and but I remember commenting with the guys. There tend to be guys. There was very few women who ran these things. Is that there was concern that there's no regeneration. There's no young people buying these books. And I think about that because when comics, I never thought that would affect comics.
Right.
And then when I came back to comics after 2010, and I'm going into comic shops, first, there's no children in there.
Right.
No teenagers are in there. Maybe there's people in their 20s, mid to late 20s, and then everyone's much older. And they immediately said, "This is just like it was with, at least with literary books."
Right.
And now it's happening here, and there's just no regeneration and stuff we've talked about in the past. But I first saw it with the books, at least with literary books, with
Right.
and yeah.
It's hard to sort of hard to grok, to use the Robert Heinlein term, the way things change sometimes, the twists and turns of them. But well, so it's interesting. You've just taken a very unusual path through all these cultural things, but
Mm-hmm.
throughout has been kind of, you seem to have a natural attraction to things that are a little further to the edge and a little more sophisticated. Even when your early comic book buying was heavy metal and Epic magazine and things like that. So that's interesting.
I don't know. It just worked out in that way. And I guess to answer your question from earlier regarding the Latin American writers.
Right. I meant to come back to them because you haven't fit those in.
Basically, for example, the actual Gore Vidal was not Latin American. I began to read his essays.
Uh-huh.
And I want to say 1990, 91. It was his essays. And I stuck with his essays. And I didn't read a novel by him until 94, 95, and that was Lincoln. And but right before then, though, I read some essays by Carlos Fuentes. I was living in Houston, and Carlos Fuentes, he's from Mexico. He died a few years ago. He's one of Mexico's greatest writers.
I think The Old Gringo might be his most well-known here. Is that him?
Yes, that's right. Here, although The Death of Artemio Cruz and Aura are the ones that made him an international and initially put him on the map here.
Did he get the Nobel?
No.
He was, I guess he was always discussed as that he should
get the Nobel. He was one of the many that was discussed, but he never got it. No. And he wrote some essays. I remember I saw a collection because that, in Spanish.
Mm-hmm.
And I like how he wrote his essays. And I like how he talked about them. And then in his essays, he talked about Garcia Marquez. He talked about Julio Cortázar. He talked about Borges. He talked about Onetti. He talked about Juan Rulfo. He talked about Carpentier. And he said interesting about these writers. So Carpentier was from Cuba. And he was, I don't like the word magic realism, but he was one of the ones who basically began doing that around even before Marquez did.
Mm-hmm.
Juan Rulfo wrote only one novel called Pedro Páramo and a collection of short stories. That's all he ever did. But that little book, Pedro Páramo, had a huge impact on Fuentes and on Garcia Marquez.
I didn't realize that. Okay.
In a huge way. They were both acknowledged, especially Garcia Marquez. Now, Julio Cortázar has a lot more in common with Ambrose Bierce and with Ballard. And with
I connect Ballard to those Latin American writers a lot in my head.
I'm sorry?
I often connect Ballard to the Latin American writers that I've read.
I think, he's very close basically to Julio Cortázar, because Julio Cortázar writes, although it's not science fiction, but there's maybe an element of the fantastic in it, and there's always a sinister element in it, and with Ballard stories, there's always something sinister in it.
And Ballard can write stories. I mean, Ballard has a bit of Borges in him, as many sci-fi writers do, but also, I don't know, some of his short stories remind me a lot of Garcia Marquez's short stories. They're not, one is science fiction and one isn't, but a lot of, I don't know, the magical realism, for lack of a better word, has a similar tone to Ballard. Anyway, they're probably all writing around the same time in different countries. But.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, and and they're both very conventional men in how they lived. I remember
Ah,
Martin Amis, when he went to interview Ballard in the early 80s, was quite surprised how conventional he was. Nice family, nice home, everything was
right.
organized. And you're the man who wrote Crash,
Yeah.
and so, but, and that's what, I thought was pretty cool. And that's the way some of these writers are. But when Fuentes wrote those essays, I began to look for those writers.
Hmm.
And I began to say, well, maybe I should read a book by Fuentes.
And when did you read those essays by Fuentes? Was
This would
this
have
your
been
already?
92,
So were you
1990.
already collecting things like
Yeah.
James
Oh,
Joyce and the like by
yeah.
then?
I already had read Joyce. I had read
Hmm.
Lawrence. I had read all these writers by then. And so when Fuentes would mention Balzac, who I had not read, but I already knew who Balzac was.
Right.
When Fuentes is talking about these writers and mentioning all these Europeans
Hmm.
as an influence on these guys, I was already there.
Right.
Oh, I had already read Faulkner, and
It was a big
Faulkner,
influence on them too.
bingo, huge influence on
Right.
Latin American, and as you know, on the French post-world, like Sartre and all that generation,
I
Camus.
actually did not know that Faulkner was an influence on the French. I knew he was a big
Yeah,
influence on the Latin American writers.
huge, and also on Godard.
Uh-huh.
Remember Godard's Breathless, when at one point Jean Seberg is reading a book by Faulkner, and she quotes from I think the Wild Palms, where she's telling her lover, if you had to choose between grief and nothing, I would choose grief, and that's how that novel ends, right? And so Faulkner was huge in France and
Right.
huge in Latin America. Even to this day, he's always mentioned,
Right.
especially his book As I Lay Dying, which is told from the perspective of numerous people, including a dead woman. So this
I
before
won-
magic realism, he was doing it.
I wonder where Faulkner lies in the US now. I know Hemingway's kind of faded. When I was growing up, Hemingway and Faulkner were the two giants.
I
But
don't know who reads Faulkner now.
yeah,
I have
I don't
no
know
idea.
if people used to have to read him in high school and college, but I don't know if they still do.
I don't, I don't know. I mean, I rarely come across people who say, "Hey, I just read The Sound of Fury," or As I Lay Dying. It doesn't work that way unless they
Yeah.
have to read it. But even then,
Right.
I don't see it as part of the canon. Um,
Right.
but
Yeah.
among Latin American writers, Mexican writers, they read him as if he's one of them.
Well, again, you kind of defy what people might assume because they might assume that your literary reading might have started with Latin American writers,
Mm-mm,
given that you have a Latin American background. But
mm-mm. No, it went the
and
other way
have you tried reading any of those writers in Spanish, or did you read
Yes, I
them
read
in
them in
English?
Spanish
Oh,
and
you
in
did.
English.
Both. Okay.
I've retained enough of my Spanish to do so, and so I read them in both. Borges is easy to read in Spanish, so is Carlos. Um, let's see, Marquez is also easy to read in Spanish. Llosa is also to read in Spanish. Carpentier can be difficult to read in Spanish because he's very he uses a lot of metaphors in his writing,
Uh-huh.
and also I read books from Spain, and as you know, it's a whole other dialect in
Right.
Spain.
So in some of these writers, I can't remember whether Fuentes does it, but Marquez does endlessly long sentences. Is that the same come across in the same way in Spanish, or does it feel more natural, or does it feel kind of
It sounds
extreme?
better in Spanish because Julio Cortázar, he
Uh,
translated all of Edgar Allan Poe,
ah,
and I have some of his books that of Poe. And Poe, I like Poe,
I do
but
too.
he reads so much better in Spanish.
That's funny. I
I mean,
suspect he reads better in French too, because I know he's more popular in France than here.
yeah, because Baudelaire, because Baudelaire,
Uh,
who wrote The Flowers of Evil,
oh, is he the one who translated him?
he's
Oh,
the
that
one who
makes-
populated him, who
ah,
translated him, and made him popular in Europe when the Americans didn't.
right. Poe is a little more respected now than he was when I was growing up, but I think he's still.
Well, I didn't know there was an issue when you were growing up with him.
When I was growing up, it was kind of, yeah. They wouldn't have you read much Poe in school or anything. You had to go find it yourself.
Huh.
or at least that was my impression.
I wonder why. That's odd. But
Because I
yeah.
think it was equated with trashy horror movies or something like that.
Oh wow.
I don't know. I'm glad because I enjoyed him more by not having to read him in classes.
No, because he's always been, well, not always been seen, but since I've been reading him, he's been more of a psychological writer,
Hmm.
right? Who
Yeah.
uses horror for psychology.
Right. He pulls you deep into the mind of
Yeah.
someone who's a little off.
Absolutely. And one thing, whenever I think I had sent you some links about some Mexican shows.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you saw that, but
I might have. I've missed some of your emails. I'm sorry to say.
no, I sent you some links of some programs from Mexico. I think they're all in Mexico City, where they interview writers, and it's how they talk about books, which I just find
Oh,
fascinating.
recently you sent me something. Yeah, and I clicked on one, and you had said you thought there would be a translation, but I couldn't figure out how to get a translation.
Well, I think on YouTube you can put the auto translate. You can go to the settings and you can pick the language.
Oh, I guess I didn't realize that, and I didn't do that.
Oh,
I looked around where I thought there might be a translation, but I couldn't.
Oh, well, some of them don't have it, man. I mean, unless I sent you ones that don't have it.
Well,
But you
also
can-
sometimes the when you're on your phone or your iPad or your computer, it can be a different interface
Okay.
too.
Well, I'm
I'll go
sorry.
back though and try again because I was curious.
Because one thing I've noticed between difference between American writers, because I watched a lot of American writers interviews and such. I've always have. When I had cable, I would always watch C-SPAN and the weekend BookTube and such.
Mhm.
Is when the Latin American writers could be women, young men,
Mhm.
older men. They're talking and they'll say that Philip Roth novel, blah blah blah. Oh, and when I read Faulkner's I Lay Dying, blah, blah, blah. Or I have to say, when I read Nabokov's Lolita, blah, blah, blah. Their faces are just enchanted, and they focus on the work. And what I also like about them, they never get into the negatives about those authors' personal lives.
Yeah.
You could tell they know about it, but that's not what the point is here.
Right.
The audience knows about those authors' personal lives, but we're discussing these books here. When they discuss Faulkner, they don't discuss the stuff that may be problematic with Faulkner's fiction because they don't see it as a problem. This was the time, and these are the books, and they see something that just inspires them.
Yeah.
And it's utterly fascinating. And also how well versed they are in American and European literature, while we're not as well versed in theirs.
Right.
The exception of Marquez, Fuentes, Isabel Allende, maybe Pablo Neruda, maybe Llosa.
They needed that for a brief window. That magical realism label was a marketing tool.
Yeah.
To get those writers to us.
Yeah, it was a huge marketing tool. It worked. I don't like the term, but it's a very successful term. And yes, it exposed them to a lot of people, and I think that's fine.
Yeah, I love Mort Cinder, and I think I first learned about it from either you or Earl Grey, or maybe both of you.
Oh, Mort Cinder. I'm glad. Oh, man, it's a beautiful thing.
It's wonderful.
Absolutely beautiful.
So I'm going to have to go in a minute or two, but so do you want to address Terrence Comic Crack's inevitable question? So the inevitable question here is if Gore has done any writing himself.
No, I don't do any personal writing. No, I've done when in the 90s I did some political stuff.
So you didn't dabble in poetry along the way, or a short story here or there?
I mean, I do write. I mean, personal stuff I've written in the past just for me, but that it's just for me in the sense that anything like this, no. So no, not at all. No.
Yes. So you got us pegged, Gary. We both really like Mort Cinder. He's referring to Mort Cinder.
Beautiful. And Gary, you may Hector Germán Oesterheld. He's more famous for the El Eternauta, the Airtronaut.
Airtronaut, right? Right. He's the writer.
He's a writer.
Is he the writer? He's the writer of Mort Cinder also then.
Also the writer, but he's basically got the spirit of Bradbury.
Interesting.
He's got the spirit of Bradbury, whom he read, and his humanity. And then Gary may be aware of this. I think it's said there is, I think we all know from the Eternauta, is that in 1976, there was a military coup in Argentina. And over 40,000 people were disappeared for the liberal leftist politics. They were tortured, killed. The women, if they were pregnant, they were allowed to give birth. Then the women disappeared, and the babies were given to military families to be raised as good patriots and Catholics.
Wow.
There was incidents of men and women being drugged, put on planes, and thrown into the ocean. Hector Herman was one of them. He was captured. He had 4 or 5 daughters. They were all captured. They were never seen from again. Presumed murdered by the regime, which adds a whole nother layer to his work.
Right.
And there's a book about him and his daughters, which I've been thinking about one day reviewing. It's only translated into Spanish, but I have been in trouble how I'm going to do this. One day I'll do it to discuss in detail about his daughters and him, which I briefly alluded to in the Eternauta video, but this book goes into detail about who these girls were and what they think happened to them. I know one of them, I think, was pregnant at the time. Not knowing what ever happened to her or the child.
Wow.
Just one of them disappeared.
One of unfortunately many terrible moments in history.
Yeah.
Well, on that note, I think I'd like to point people, I probably should have done this at the beginning of the video, point people towards your channel, because you have 10 years worth of videos. You don't rush and put out a whole lot at once, but a great backlog of videos discussing all kinds of interesting little corners of comics and movies and books. You've done a video on the Ethernaut, or I don't know how to pronounce it properly.
Yes,
And
it's Spanish Eternauta, but
the Phantom and Fantomas. I learned about Fantomas from you and read I read the first French Fantomas novel because of you. So there's just all kinds of interesting things to explore on Gore's channel. I have to go, but I would love to do more digging into literary stuff.
I would love to. Thank you, Damien.
I'm probably going to branch off into a book channel along with a comic book channel, but I think some things I'll put on both channels, because when you and I have a conversation, it's going to go back and forth between books and comics and the like. So
you would be ideal for a book channel. I mean, you would be ideal. Hopefully you decide to do it.
I have an idea for my very first video, and I just need to get the energy going. Modesty Blaze, you got Gore, you got Terrence reading Modesty Blaze. Yeah, so we could talk forever. It'd be great having a one-on-one conversation with you and Terrence too, I think.
That would be great, as long as I have this little guy here.
And I love talking with people about their history as a reader. So other people who've been on here, perhaps if I find the energy, I should do that with, like Gary and Bob and Terrence and others. But so thank you everyone who hung out with us. Lots of great comments. We were talking so much, I just flashed the comments on the screen, but I think they were all good. So hopefully people will actually look at the screen at what people said. But thank you so much, Gore, and we'll do it again.
Absolutely.
As long as you can nab that good computer.
Yeah, I know. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Okay, good night, everyone. Trying to end this.